Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying Society and Culture. My name is Vanessa Bowden and I'm a lecturer in sociology at the university. My research specialises in climate change politics and social movements, so I'm here today to talk to you about changing the world. So, who has the power in our society and how can that power be challenged or transformed? Sociology has lots of great tools for us to think about this, from thinking through the structures of authority to the processes of collective resistance and the cultural forces that drive social change. They're all issues we're going to touch on today. And like your other lectures, I believe, this one is organised into four parts. So, this section we're going to talk about political power, the ability to make decisions that affect entire populations. But power is not just focused on governments. It operates through our institutions, through our laws, it operates in our everyday practices. So, understanding how power is distributed and maintained is really essential for thinking through why change can often be difficult, but also how it might occur. In the second part, we're going to look at ideas around resistance and look at social movements. So, we're going to try to think about what happens when groups organise to challenge the dominant systems and demand alternatives. One of the things that section will show us is that while we think about social change as this often linear process towards a better society and progress, that's not usually the case. Actually, a lot of the changes that we take for granted have been fought for. In the third part, we'll look at identity, specifically how technology has influenced our society. So, not only in terms actually of our identity, but the changes in the ways that we relate to each other and also the environment. So, we'll look at issues of recent social change and how social movements have responded to that. Finally, we'll look at sociology and social change more broadly. Of course, as a discipline based on social processes, sociology itself has changed over time as we've observed different impacts on the environment. So we'll consider some of the newer ways of thinking about that. And we'll also consider the role of sociology in social change. We don't just describe the world, we try to imagine alternatives as well. We try to analyse power, resistance, identity. We're going to do all those things in this lecture and then think about, okay, well, what do we actually do with this information? But first, we're going to look at political power. So, what is it? How does it operate? And why does it matter? I think when we first think about political power, the first thing we go to is state power. So, the different systems of government that we see in operation around the world. And I would emphasize, we're not political science students. So, this lecture isn't going to be focused on the nuances of different government systems, but it is important to recognize that there are different processes in place for nation states to make decisions about their populations, right? It's crucial to understanding political power. So you're probably familiar with these four types of government. Democracy is our government system, a system of government where power ostensibly rests with the people. And we elect our representatives to then go and make policies that are hopefully in our interests. A dictatorship is a government controlled by one person with absolute power. And a theocracy is a government ruled by religious leaders or based on religious laws. An oligarchy, kind of similar to a dictatorship, but it's a government where power is held by a small elite group of people. So these are the sorts of things that we usually think about when we first think about political power. But I would like us as sociologists, we always like to make things a little bit more complicated, to resist the notion that these political systems necessarily actually tell us anything about the people in those nation states. What we want to do as sociologists in thinking about the way power has developed over time is recognise that systems of government themselves have actually developed over time and they're a product of history. So power has shifted from monarchs and emperors towards more representative systems in most places. But people's system of government is not a reflection of their people. They're shaped by wars, they're shaped by exposure to empires, by religion, by cultural forces. So, one of the things that we want to think about when we think about state power is actually that state power is a result of a historical process. That also means that those power relations can change, those systems of government can change, and we've obviously, well, maybe it's not so obvious because we haven't seen a change in Australia for a long time, but we want to be aware that they can change, and we have historically seen that for the history students in the room. A lot of the time when we think of these systems of government, we think of them as being either liberal or authoritarian. So this is quite an interesting way to think about it, but we would encourage you to think about this as really being more of a spectrum of political ideology rather than one or the other. These ways of thinking come from European thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes wrote in the context of the Civil War, and he argued that a strong sovereign state or authority, was needed to prevent chaos. And this emphasised security over liberty, over freedom. On the other hand, Locke advanced the idea of natural rights, so to life, to liberty and property. And so this argument is around the idea that government should really only exist by the consent of the government, and power should be limited by constitutional principles. These contrasting views have shaped our understanding of liberalism and how it works within government. So there's a history there in terms of the ways that we approach our ideas about government, and I'm sure you can see reflected in those ideas about liberalism and authoritarianism some of the debates that we have about government too. And so you've probably actually come across this, the political compass, and you can see here modern political analysis uses these two dimensions as well. But it talks about authoritarianism and libertarianism usually. This is the axis that is concerned with personal and civic freedoms. So libertarianism favours individual autonomy, a minimal state interference, and a strong protection for civil liberties, whereas authoritarianism emphasises that centralised control, obedience to authority, and often will limit freedom in the name of order or tradition. You can see on the other axis, it's obviously based around economic organisation and talking about the economic left and the economic right. So the left supports the redistribution of wealth, social welfare, and collective solutions to inequality. It often also supports state intervention into markets where in order to improve equality. The economic right, on the other hand, emphasises free markets, private property, and limited government intervention. So there's a real emphasis there on individual responsibility and competition. So you've probably come across this, I don't know, like every election time you get polls that ask you to fill in questionnaires and they'll sort of plot you in relation to this. And it is a useful way of thinking about not only where power lies, but also where our ideas about power lie and what we support. The frameworks within this are so ubiquitous, they've actually become memes. And if you want to go down a rabbit hole after reading your textbook, you can actually have a look. There's a political compass subreddit that has some fun illustrations of this, and I'll just give you one for you to go and look at in your own time, illustrating Christmas. There were a bunch of other ones that I did not think were so appropriate for a lecture. But you can see here, I guess, Jesus and Santa are put on the authoritarian side of being pro-Christmas because, they're leaders that support it. Anyway, I'll leave you to look through that maybe after you've finished the lecture. In terms of thinking about political power, though, we can also see it in other institutions. Mann writes about there being four sources of kind of formal power in our society. So we've discussed political power, but there's also economic power, so the power that resides in markets and resources in the private sector. Military, police power, this is really the socially organised use of force, of violence. They're the only people in Australia, at least, who are authorised to use violence to control the public. And ideological power, which is quite a bit harder to pin down, but it's referring to our beliefs and norms. You can probably see them most clearly reflected in the media. Something that's important to recognise, I mean, all of these ways of looking at how power operates can be quite useful for having a contained unit of analysis if you're doing research on something. But of course, they overlap all the time. So ideological power overlaps with political power. Something like social media being banned for young people, right? That comes from an idea that we need to protect young people, that we're not happy with the way that social media operates. It's coming from an ideological perspective, but actually using political power to enforce those ideas. We obviously see the connections between economic and political power every time the government tries to tax anything. We see it when the government tries to tax fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel sector will actually evoke its economic power for advertising and push it into the ideological space to try and convince the public to come up against those taxes, and then the government responds, usually. So look, we can see that these spheres of power really often overlap, and I think it's important to recognise that. And this is really reflected in what C. Wright Mills calls the power elite. So those at the top of those overlapping institutions who shape decisions are often connected. Excuse me. They send their kids to the same private schools. They might be members of exclusive clubs. Even in Australia, we still have clubs that limit women's participation in them. So, they engage in their social lives as well as these sort of formal spheres of power to actually create a consensus around particular decisions. Robert Michaels actually goes a step further and argues that complex organisations inevitably produce an iron law of oligarchy. Remember, to the political system, so the rule of a few. So power concentrates at the top and then reproduces itself. A really stark example of this might be the 2024 US presidential election, where Elon Musk reportedly contributed $200 million to Donald Trump's campaign and was rewarded with a role in restructuring the government. Obviously, that actually fell down at one stage, but it shows us a few things, right? It shows us the ways in which the spheres overlap. It also shows us some potential changes to the form of governance in the US from that time. Something really important, though, to think about when it comes to power is we can recognise it in these institutions, and we can see that it does tend to coalesce and ratchet at the top. But power is also everywhere. It's not just in parliaments. Politics itself is pervasive. So think about the fact that we talk about things like office politics, right? That's not talking about setting government policy, it's talking about the power dynamics within the office. You know, who has the ear of the boss? Who has the support of colleagues? So we can think about power as operating in that official, institutional, structural sense, but also operating in our everyday lives. And I think that's where it gets a little bit more exciting in terms of thinking about social change. So, Michel Foucault is probably the most famous theorist when it comes to thinking about the idea that power is everywhere. He introduced the concept of governmentality. So this is a shift away from the sovereign power, so rulers commanding subjects, and towards a disciplinary power where we actually regulate ourselves. This grew out of Foucault's observation that the rise of scientific knowledge, especially in statistics and medicine and economics, actually produced new ways of thinking about populations as as objects of calculation and management. So actually ways of controlling populations through categorizing them. So rather than ruling through law or force, modern states began to govern by deploying expert knowledge, and that would shape behaviour, optimize health, regulate social life, and ultimately lead to better economic outcomes. So, oh, sorry, I'm just going to go back to governmentality because one important thing to remember about it, actually two things. It has the word government in it, but it's actually referring to the observation that you could think of it as our mentality, as our way of thinking is the process that has the power in this instance. So Foucault is moving away from the formal institutional structure of governments and actually arguing that we are governing ourselves. So there's this idea of governing at a distance. So governments don't have to intervene because we are behaving, because we're good citizens, because that's what we want to do and that's how we're socialized to behave. Okay, so today we govern ourselves through social norms and expert advice. We could think about this in terms of health, right? We monitor our diets, our exercise, our mental well-being, and this isn't because the state forces us to, it's because there are norms and expertise that encourage it. Really ubiquitously seen in social media. You know, you open up anything, well, I guess it depends on your algorithm, but I think a lot of people would be very well aware of the sort of prominence of reels talking about what your morning regime should be like. We have apps that are there to sort of track every single movement we make or every calorie we consume. We have wearables that monitor us constantly and then send the information into systems that then tell us back what we should be doing. This is what Foucault calls biopower, power over life. It's really focused on health, productivity, and population well-being. But it's important to recognize that this is not neutral. What biopower fails to recognise is the social conditions in which our health practices are formed. So our education, our income, our postcode, all of these things are known to shape our health outcomes. But what biopower does is turn these social issues into our individual responsibilities. I'm sorry to do this for those of you who want to forget about COVID, but it is a good example of the ways in which many of these kinds of powers have been used. So just to finish with an example to think through this. As I've mentioned, health determinants, our social conditions have a very strong influence on our health outcomes. In terms of our responses to COVID, it was very interesting to watch. We had the suppression being a mix of state enforcement and media messaging. So the state actually invoking laws and restrictions, but coupled with ideological power through the media, sort of, yes, explaining what was happening and why, but also, putting moral pressure on people to actually govern ourselves. So the evocation of governmentality. And certainly in the process of COVID, it sort of went from state power much more into governmentality. So as the vaccine became available, states started opening up, and we actually saw the responsibility shifting away from the state and state enforcement and over to us, to mask wearing, to vaccination. This this whole process highlighted the unequal and disproportionate impacts on health. COVID concentrated very much in disadvantaged groups. And, actually, COVID did, and so did the lockdowns and the impacts of that. So we can look at COVID itself, for instance, and see that people who were already at a health disadvantage were much more vulnerable to COVID. At the other end, we also saw things like the public housing lockdown in Victoria. I know there was an area in the Central Coast where police were deployed. We saw the unequal consequences of lockdowns. People like myself who had a job with the university were fine, just going behind the screen and working from there. But of course, other people whose jobs were deemed necessary still had to go to work. We had the construction industry actually advocate an exception for itself, and we had people actually lose their incomes. So we saw all of these uneven consequences and multiple ways in which power was deployed. So I would say, we really saw health inequalities become quite stark, and we saw that personal choices would have collective consequences. We also saw that we were disciplining ourselves and also disciplining others. So, that phase of dobbing people in if they were seen to be, or we thought they might be, going against the rules. Beyond biopolitics, Mbembe talks about necropolitics. So while biopolitics manages life, necropolitics manages death, deciding whose lives are expendable. Mbembe argues that contemporary forms of power often operate through exposing populations rather than simply controlling life. People are exposed to not only in the situation of COVID death, but particular risks. So we see these inequalities and the way that power operates in that as well. Sorry, that's a very negative example to lead you on, but we're only at the beginning of the lecture. So to take away from this, power is not just in parliaments, it's everywhere. It's in our institutions, and it's also in our norms and everyday practices. We can see it in different spheres, but remember that they're overlapping. Governmentality is not about governments, it's about the ways that we govern ourselves. And our emphasis as sociologists is always on the historical production of our social circumstances and our social inequalities. Okay, that's it from me. For the next part of this lecture, we're going to look at resistance and social movements. So, what do we do with this information that power isn't just in governments? How can we potentially, hopefully, make the world better? Thanks.